Maybe your deepest collapse did not begin when life turned against you. Maybe it began the moment you started calling every passing storm my story, every setback my identity, every delay my proof that I am not enough. That is where the weight became unbearable. Not in the event itself, but in the instant a mental character stepped forward and claimed ownership of it. You were not just feeling pain anymore. You were manufacturing a person out of pain and then asking that person to survive. That is why you feel so tired in ways sleep cannot fix. You are not only carrying work, expectations, bills, heartbreak, uncertainty, time, and pressure. You are also carrying an invented center that must constantly explain itself, justify itself, protect itself, compare itself, improve itself, and be seen. That maintenance never ends. It is not called maintenance in ordinary life, of course. It is called ambition, self-respect, standards, healing, growth, identity, purpose. But beneath all those names, there is often a single exhausting movement, the effort to keep the idea of me from collapsing. And the mind is unbelievably fast at performing that trick. Something happens, and before you have even fully felt it, the narrator is already in the room. Why does this always happen to me? What does this say about me? How far behind am I now? What will people think? What does this prove about my life? Notice the violence hidden in that speed, because an event has barely arrived before a self is built around it, and once that self is built, the event stops being simple and becomes biography. That is why what you call failure is usually not just failure. It is failure plus ownership. It is pain plus self-reference. It is disappointment plus the intimate drama of a center declaring, this reduces me, this defines me, this humiliates me, this exposes me, this confirms what I feared. The wound itself may be sharp, but the identity formed around the wound is what makes it feel endless. A missed opportunity can hurt. A relationship ending can hurt. Being rejected, overlooked, replaced, outgrown, ignored, contradicted, betrayed, or left behind can hurt. But what turns hurt into a private myth is the one who says, this happened to the person I must continue being. That is when a moment becomes a sentence, a delay becomes an indictment, a stumble becomes a personality, and one season of difficulty becomes the entire meaning of a life. This is why so many people are not merely suffering, they are defending their suffering. They do not protect it consciously. They protect it by repeating the character it supports, the one who is always misunderstood, the one who almost made it, the one who gives everything and gets nothing, the one who keeps trying and never arrives, the one who was never chosen, the one who was always too much or not enough. Pain becomes precious when it keeps the story of a separate self intact. That attachment is subtler than most people realize. It is not just attachment to success, or love, or recognition, or healing. It is attachment to being someone in relation to those things. Someone becoming successful, someone being rejected, someone evolving, someone awakening, someone recovering. The ego does not merely want relief. It wants a role within the relief, a signature on the transformation, a crown placed on the head of the one who struggled. That is why even your most noble efforts can become disguised forms of self-preservation. You work to defend a self-image. You speak to defend a position. You stay silent to defend a mask. You achieve to defend value. You suffer to defend depth. You even search spiritually to defend the feeling that there is still a you who might finally become pure enough, wise enough, healed enough, disciplined enough, conscious enough to deserve peace. But look carefully at the contradiction hidden there. The one seeking freedom is often the very structure that depends on bondage in order to continue. The one begging for release is the same psychological center that survives by postponing release. It says, soon I will arrive, soon I will heal, soon I will transcend, soon I will become the one who is finally at peace. Yet if peace were truly present now, without conditions, what would happen to the seeker that built its whole identity around not having it? This is why the texts attributed to Wu Hsin cut so sharply through ordinary self-understanding. They point, again and again, toward a brutal simplicity. The person you defend with such seriousness is not as solid as it feels. What you call me is often a bundle of memory, reaction, fear, conditioning, language, comparison, habit, and repetition being held together by constant mental narration. It feels real because it is rehearsed. It feels central because it is repeated. It feels permanent because you keep returning to it like a tongue to a broken tooth. And because that center feels central, everything becomes dangerous. Another person's success becomes your diminishment. Time becomes accusation. Aging becomes insult. Uncertainty becomes threat. Silence becomes exposure. Even peace becomes suspicious, because genuine stillness threatens the machinery that runs on becoming. A self built from lack cannot relax for long, because the moment nothing is missing, its throne begins to disappear. So the mind keeps moving. More proof, more progress, more recognition, more certainty, more control, more clarity, more status, more love, more healing, more reassurance. It promises you that the next milestone will quiet the ache, but the promise is a trick, because the ache is not caused by the lack of the next milestone. It is caused by the structure of identity that feeds on incompleteness. That is why the self is always talking about later. Later, I will be enough. Later, I will understand. Later, I will recover what I lost. Later, I will finally feel secure. Later, I will become the version of me that deserves the life I want. The psychological self survives through postponement because an immediate peace would expose the fraud of its constant urgency. And yet reality keeps refusing to cooperate with the script. People change, bodies change, moods change, money changes, plans change, reputation changes, relationships change, motivation changes, beliefs change. The world will not freeze itself to protect a mental image, and every time it refuses, the ego calls that refusal a personal injustice. But perhaps that refusal is the most merciful thing happening to you. Perhaps what you have been calling failure is not life punishing you, but life refusing to sustain an illusion forever. Perhaps the job that broke, the relationship that ended, the plan that dissolved, the identity that cracked, the confidence that collapsed, the image that could no longer be defended, were all exposing something far more important than your weakness. They were showing you the instability of what you were trying so desperately to be. Because the body breathing did not fail, presence itself did not fail, the fact of awareness did not fail. What failed was an image of who you believed you should be by now. What failed was a timeline, a comparison, a fantasy, a rehearsed self-concept woven from culture, envy, memory, fear, pressure, and imagination. That changes everything, because now the suffering is no longer only about events. It is about identification with an image that cannot stay alive without constant supply. This is why the collapse feels so humiliating. It is not only that something went wrong in the outer world, it is that the mind cannot maintain the version of you it was secretly worshipping. The ideal self starts to crack, and with that crack comes panic, because the ego interprets the loss of image as the loss of being. But an image collapsing is not being collapsing. A mask breaking is not existence breaking. Read that again with your whole nervous system. A mask breaking is not existence breaking. A role dissolving is not reality dissolving. A concept failing is not life failing. What is actually under threat is the storyline, not the aliveness in which the storyline appears. Yet because you have spent years confusing the two, every blow to the story feels like a blow to the core. That is why your inner life can become such an endless courtroom. You revisit the past to prove who you are. You interpret the present to stabilize who you are. You imagine the future to rescue who you are. But while all that arguing continues, you do not really meet the present. You meet only raw material for identity maintenance. A conversation is no longer just a conversation. It becomes validation or rejection. A project is no longer just a project. It becomes confirmation or humiliation. A loss is no longer just a loss. It becomes evidence about your worth. Even rest becomes complicated because if you stop producing, improving, proving, healing, fixing, or becoming, the mind whispers that you are slipping into irrelevance. That is the prison few people notice. It is not only the prison of pain, it is the prison of importance. The self wants to matter in every scene, even if it must matter as the wounded one, the neglected one, the exceptional one, the almost there one, the misunderstood one, the spiritually advanced one, the broken one, the resilient one. It would often rather be dramatically miserable than quietly non-existent. This is why some people keep returning to the same emotional hell and calling it fate. The pattern is painful, yes, but it also confirms the character. It keeps the storyline emotionally vivid. It gives the self something to hold, something to narrate, something to rehearse, something to be. The suffering is not loved for itself. It is preserved because it keeps the person feeling real. The strangest part is that all of this is observable. Thoughts appear, sensations appear, emotions appear, the tight feeling behind the eyes appears, the urge to defend, explain, retaliate, withdraw, impress, perform, and survive appears. Even the intimate feeling of I am this person in this body carrying this story appears. And anything that appears can be noticed. Anything that is noticed cannot be the deepest noticing itself. Before the thought, I ruined my life, there is the awareness of that thought. Before shame floods the body, there is the field in which shame is known. Before the sentence I am failing rises up, there is already a silent capacity in which the sentence becomes visible. That silent capacity does not fail in the way the self-image fails. It does not improve in the way the ego wants to improve. It does not become more worthy when praised or less real when ignored. It is present before the victory, during the collapse, after the embarrassment, beneath the confusion, and even in the middle of the mind's attempt to turn this into a new identity. It is not a trophy. It is not a special state. It is not a reward for the worthy. And this is exactly where the mind tries to perform one final theft. It hears something true and immediately says, good, I understand now. I am becoming the aware one, the awakened one, the detached one, the one who sees through the illusion. But that is still the old center repainting itself. It is the same actor changing costumes. It is the ego putting on white clothes and calling itself free. So this is not an invitation to become a more spiritual person. It is not an invitation to replace the failed identity with a wiser identity. It is not a call to use elevated language while preserving the same psychological center underneath. That would be cosmetic transcendence, metaphysical makeup, a polished prison. The point is more uncompromising than that. What is seen is not what sees, and what changes is not the deepest reality of what you are. If you can notice your self-image, you are not limited to that self-image. If you can notice your fear of falling behind, you are not limited to that fear. If you can notice the tension of becoming someone, you are not limited to that tension. If even the intimate sense of being a localized somebody can be observed, then the observer is not confined in the same way to the observed construction. The mind hates that kind of seeing because it cannot own it. It wants an object, a method, a conclusion, a badge, a result it can place on the shelf and say, now I have attained. But what is fundamental here is not an object to possess. It cannot be captured as a thing among things. It is the open fact of aware presence itself, the silent background that was never absent, even while the personality spent years screaming for proof that it existed. So perhaps your apparent failure is not the tragedy you thought it was. Perhaps you tried to live as an image, and images eventually split. Perhaps you tried to love yourself as a concept, and concepts cannot hold warmth for long. Perhaps you tried to secure yourself as a character, but characters require an audience, a memory, a script, an endless rehearsal. Life did not betray you by refusing to uphold that strain forever. It exposed the strain. This is why the breakdown can feel almost sacred without becoming sentimental. Not because the universe wrote a special theatrical lesson just for you, not because every loss is secretly a reward in disguise, but because anything false is unstable, and sooner or later, instability reveals itself. The separate self is unstable, so it needs constant psychological maintenance, and what requires relentless maintenance reveals its own artificiality. You do not need to remind yourself every few minutes that space exists. You do not need to constantly defend the sky in order for the sky to remain the sky. Silence does not need propaganda to remain silence. Only the persona needs repetition. Only the mask needs reinforcement. Only the fiction needs continuous narration in order to feel solid. And when that narration weakens, something very simple begins to reappear. Not fireworks, not mystical superiority, not a glamorous spiritual identity, just a strange, almost offensive lightness. Pain may still visit, bills may still arrive, the body may still tire, people may still leave, projects may still fail in ordinary worldly terms. But the suffering is no longer being colonized in the same total way by an imaginary center. There is sadness, but less my tragic definition. There is action, but less my grand importance. There is uncertainty, but less my personal annihilation. Life remains dynamic, but the private theater begins to lose its monopoly on meaning. And that lightness can feel threatening at first. The mind equates heaviness with depth. It thinks seriousness about the self is proof of intelligence, maturity, integrity, and moral weight. It suspects that without the burden of personal identity, life will become shallow, careless, or empty. Yet what if the opposite is true? What if the obsession with self is what made life feel so cramped? What if the constant need to defend an image is what kept love conditional, work neurotic, rest guilty, and ambition poisoned? What if the dignity you have been searching for does not come from perfecting the character, but from no longer kneeling before it? What if freedom is not freedom for the person, but freedom from the hypnotic belief that the person is the deepest thing you are? Then the question changes completely. It is no longer, how do I finally become enough? It becomes, who is this I that must become enough before it can rest? It is no longer, how do I repair my image? It becomes, why has an image been mistaken for my existence? It is no longer, how do I win at life as this separate center? It becomes, is that separate center real in the way I have assumed? Stay with that without rushing to answer. Do not turn it into a slogan. Do not decorate it with borrowed wisdom. Do not package it into a new personality. Just look. The thought appears. The fear appears. The ache appears. The story appears. The one claiming ownership of all of it appears too. And if all of that appears, then none of it can be the final ground. The character can tremble, collapse, reinvent itself, chase, hide, suffer, perform, awaken, and suffer again. But what knows the entire movement is not moving in the same way. It was here before the self-description. It remains during the confusion. It does not need applause, defense, continuity, or conclusion in order to be. So maybe the most brutal and liberating possibility is this. The thing you spent years trying to save is the thing exhausting you. The one you kept polishing, protecting, explaining, improving, advertising, avenging, and healing is the very knot tightening around your throat. And what you have been calling failure may be the sound of that knot finally loosening. Maybe life has not been trying to destroy you. Maybe it has been refusing to keep lying to you. Maybe every crack in the image, every collapse of certainty, every season where your script burned in your hands has been opening the same silent question. Not, How do I become a better character? But what remains when the character stops being believed? Sit in that long enough, and the whole drama starts to lose its spell. Not because the world becomes easy, not because pain disappears, not because you become untouchable, but because the center that turned every movement into a referendum on your worth is no longer being worshipped with the same blind devotion. Then even failure changes shape. It is no longer absolute proof of your deficiency. It becomes a crack in the costume, a break in the trance, a collapse in the architecture of pretending. The end of a false continuity can feel like death to the fiction, but to what is real, it may be the first breath that was not filtered through the fear of being nobody. And maybe that is the real terror the ego has always avoided. Not pain, not uncertainty, not rejection, non-existence as a separate psychological ruler, because suffering as someone still feels safer to the mind than dissolving as an illusion. But if the illusion loosens, what disappears is not life. What disappears is the compulsive claim of ownership over life. So before you ask how to conquer your circumstances, outgrow your weakness, outrun your past, or finally become the version of yourself you can respect, stop. Look harder than your habits have ever allowed. Who is the one demanding victory? Who is the one insisting it has failed? Who is the one terrified of not becoming somebody? And when no thought can successfully locate that solid owner, what is still here, undeniable, before the next story begins,